Late one night, Sam went to the graveyard and found his best friend, Adeline, sitting there. She was quiet, still, and her skin was pale, almost gray. Sam knew she wasn't alive anymore, but he couldn't leave her behind. He decided to bring her home. The night of the party was supposed to be just another chance for friends to laugh and unwind. Adeline Marcus arrived with her best friend, Sam, feeling a bit out of place in her thrifted dress and barely their makeup. The party was at the home of the Walters, a wealthy white family in town known for hosting the biggest gatherings. Inside, the music pulsed, laughter echoed, and people filled every corner of the room. Sam and Adeline tried to blend in, but it felt like everyone was staring, especially at Adeline. Among the crowd, a group of boys sat watching her. The Walters' son Jackson and his friends, older boys known for wild stunts and recklessness. Sam noticed the way they looked at her, but he brushed it off, hoping it was nothing. As the night wore on, Adeline felt the party's energy shift. She caught Jackson's eye and was uncomfortable with the attention. When she told Sam, he urged her to leave to go home with him. But Adeline didn't want to overreact, and part of her didn't want to leave Sam alone. Jackson and his friends offered her a drink, calling her uptight when she hesitated. Feeling a mix of frustration and pressure, she finally accepted. But soon after, everything began to blur. The lights, the voices, and the faces around her. She felt strange, dizzy, and trapped. The next thing she knew, she was being led outside, away from Sam's sight. Adeline's senses blurred as Jackson and his friends led her toward the detached pool house, away from the main party. She stumbled, feeling the effects of whatever had been in her drink, her voice slurring as she tried to ask where they were going. The boys laughed, brushing off her questions and telling her she just needed some fresh air. Jackson reassured her with a crooked smile, his hand gripping her arm a bit too tight. Inside the pool house, they pulled her toward an old storage closet that still smelled of chlorine and dust. Adeline's vision blurred, but she realized too late that they'd shut her inside. She banged on the door, shouting, pleading to be let out, but her words were muffled. Outside, she could hear the boys laughing. One of them shouted, "It's just a prank, Adeline." Her heart raced as the darkness pressed in on her, the air growing thick and stale. She tried to breathe, to calm herself, but fear clawed at her chest. She was locked in, trapped in a cramped, airless closet, and panic made her breaths short and ragged. Hours seemed to pass as her strength waned, until she slumped to the floor, her vision dimming to black. By morning, when Adeline's lifeless body was found by the Walters groundskeeper, panic swept through the household. The police were called, and the boys quickly huddled, discussing their story. Jackson led the charge, insisting they'd just been messing around and hadn't meant to hurt her. "We thought she'd be fine," he told the officers. "We didn't know she was in there for that long. It was just a joke. She could have opened the door any time." Another boy chimed in, adding, "We were just playing like always. We even play basketball rough. It's how we are." They framed it as a misunderstanding, a prank gone wrong, just like how they'd roughhoused on the court. But Adeline's face, pale and still, said otherwise, as did the bruises on her arms and the signs of her desperate attempts to escape. The boys claimed innocence, even remorse, but their smirks had faded into nervous glances as the investigation began. To them, she was just another casualty of a night that got out of hand. Word of Adeline's death spread through town like wildfire, sending shockwaves through her community. Her family and friends were devastated, unable to comprehend how a lively, warm-hearted girl could meet such a tragic end. The newspapers called it a freak accident, but whispers in the community told a darker story. Sam couldn't shake the details. The prank, the boys claimed, was harmless. He knew the boys' roughhousing all too well. He'd seen how they pushed boundaries for fun, never facing consequences. Still, something about the story felt wrong, nagging at him, eating away at his belief that justice would be done. Sam couldn't get Adeline's last moments out of his mind. He hadn't wanted her to go to that party, had even tried to convince her to leave with him when he saw Jackson and his friends watching her. But Adeline had brushed it off, and he'd reluctantly stayed, thinking she'd be safe. Now, the what-ifs were overwhelming. He was haunted by her face, her laugh, her last glance before she disappeared into the crowd. Sam's guilt was relentless, pushing him to do more than mourn. He began gathering any details he could find, asking questions, but each answer felt like a door slamming shut. His sorrow turned to determination. He couldn't just let this pass as another accident. The town's police chief, pressured by the outcry, opened an investigation, but it felt half-hearted. The Walters family was powerful, and Jackson's father was well-connected, known to support the police department through donations. Interviews with the boys were conducted, but Sam could see they were being treated lightly. Jackson's story was airtight. We were just joking around. It wasn't supposed to go that far. He leaned into the idea that they'd just been playing, comparing it to their rough-and-tumble games. With no clear signs of physical assault, and Adeline's body showing only minor bruising, the police began to lean toward the boys' version of events. When the coroner's report came back, it officially listed Adeline's cause of death as accidental suffocation, due to her inability to get out of the closet. It explained that she likely passed out from lack of air, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. He remembered the bruises on her arms that no one seemed to care about, the signs of her struggling to break free. To Sam, these details mattered. He realized that if he didn't take action, the world would move on, leaving Adeline's death as nothing more than an unfortunate accident. The town began to fracture as people took sides. Some residents, aware of the Walters family's influence, were quick to believe the accident story. They insisted the boys hadn't meant harm, that Adeline's death was a sad but unintentional tragedy. Others, especially those who knew Adeline, weren't convinced. Rumors spread about the boys' past behavior, stories of other pranks that had crossed lines, of laughter that never quite fit. Sam found allies in people who shared his doubts, but he also met resistance from those who feared stirring up trouble with such a prominent family. Adeline's mother, overcome with grief, began to push back against the official story. At the funeral, she'd noticed how coldly Jackson and his friends had paid their respects, their gazes shifting, their expressions forced. She didn't believe for a second that Adeline's death was an accident. In a tearful statement to the local newspaper, she demanded justice, calling on the community to recognize that her daughter's life was worth more than a reckless joke. Her words stirred emotions across town, adding fuel to the fire and inspiring Sam to push harder in his search for answers. Sam couldn't sleep, haunted by Adeline's face, her voice, her presence now lost forever. The memory of her laugh, her sense of humor, and the warmth she brought to those around her now became a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. Fueled by guilt and grief, Sam resolved to dig deeper into what had happened. He knew he was up against a powerful family, but he also knew Adeline deserved better than to be remembered as just a tragic accident. Late at night, he made a quiet vow to himself. He would uncover the truth, no matter how hard it was or what it cost him. Sam began piecing together Adeline's last night, starting with the party. He remembered details that most had overlooked. How uncomfortable Adeline had seemed, the way Jackson and his friends had focused on her, and the strange way she'd looked after drinking from the cup they gave her. He spoke to others at the party, hoping someone would remember seeing something unusual. A few people admitted they'd noticed Jackson and his friends leading Adeline away, but they brushed it off as harmless fun. Sam realized that this was part of the problem. Too many people had looked the other way, and now it was time to confront that silence. While searching for anyone who might have seen more, Sam heard from a friend that a girl named Ruby had been outside near the pool house that night. Ruby was shy, often keeping to herself, but Sam knew she'd been close enough to see what had happened. It took some convincing, but finally, Ruby agreed to meet him. She hesitated at first, eyes darting around nervously, but eventually, she told him what she'd seen. Ruby had watched as the boys had laughed outside the pool house, throwing taunts toward the door and daring Adeline to come out if she wasn't scared. Her words chilled Sam, and he knew Ruby's story was the beginning of unraveling their prank for what it really was. The next day, Adeline's mother contacted Sam, asking him to come by. She'd seen how close he was to Adeline and knew he'd been troubled by the accident narrative. When he arrived, she gave him a box of Adeline's belongings and said she hoped he might find something useful. Inside, Sam found her diary, her favorite bracelet, and a few photos of the two of them laughing together. But one entry caught his eye, a recent entry where Adeline mentioned feeling nervous about Jackson. "He keeps looking at me like I'm some game he wants to win," she'd written. The words sent a chill down his spine and renewed his determination to see justice served, and realized he couldn't do this alone. He approached some of Adeline's friends, asking for their help to raise awareness about what had happened. They began quietly posting on social media, sharing memories of Adeline and mentioning their doubts about the accident. They shared photos, tagged news outlets, and wrote about the kind, vibrant girl Adeline had been. Within days, people started to notice. The posts began circulating, with more and more people questioning the boy's innocence. The Walters family noticed too, and soon, whispers of defamation and misunderstandings began to circle back to Sam. Jackson's father, a well-known businessman with a reputation for controlling narratives, wasn't pleased with the attention Adeline's death was now getting. He made a public statement, saying his son was deeply hurt by the accusations and that the incident had been a tragic accident that had traumatized all involved. His words were carefully chosen, painting Jackson as a victim of a misunderstood prank. Sam watched the statement on TV, his hands clenched into fists. He could see through the words, through the crocodile tears, but he knew it wouldn't be easy to break past the Walters' influence. With more people questioning the accident story, Sam and his friends organized a memorial vigil for Adeline, aiming to remind the community of who she really was and to honor her life. They held it in the park where she'd loved to play as a child, a place untouched by the tragedy. Hundreds of people turned out, candles lighting up the night, and stories of Adeline's kindness, strength, and dreams filled the air. Her mother spoke, thanking everyone and reminding them that Adeline's life was more than just an accident. Sam realized that this support was what they needed to keep going, to fight back against those who would rather bury the truth. At the vigil, Sam met Karen Ellis, a journalist from a nearby city who had heard rumors about Adeline's case. She asked Sam if he'd be willing to tell her everything he knew. Nervously, he agreed, hoping that she could shed light on the injustice. Over coffee, he poured out everything. The night of the party, Jackson's reputation, Ruby's account, and the bruises he'd seen on Adeline's arms. Karen listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she took notes. She promised to dig deeper and hinted that she'd been tracking similar cases involving young girls and the dangerous entitlement of privileged boys. Sam felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone willing to shine a light on what had happened. As Karen's article prepared to go live, the Walters family's legal team went on high alert. They issued a cease and desist letter to Sam, Ruby, and Adeline's family, claiming they were spreading falsehoods and defaming Jackson. The letter warned of serious legal repercussions if they continued harassment. It was an attempt to intimidate, but Sam wasn't easily frightened anymore. Instead, he felt emboldened. He knew he was close to uncovering the truth, and he wouldn't let the Walters silence him. Finally, the article dropped. Karen's piece exposed the details of the night, the history of Jackson's behavior, and the many cracks in the story of accident. The community was stunned. Those who had doubted Sam before now began to see the truth, recognizing that Adeline's life had been carelessly ended for a twisted game. Sam felt the impact immediately. More people reached out to him, offering support, sharing stories of other injustices they'd experienced. And even though he knew they'd face an uphill battle, he felt, for the first time, that justice for Adeline might actually be possible. With Karen's article making waves, the small town became a divided ground. Some residents rallied behind Adeline's family, shocked by the unveiled truths, while others clung to the Walters family's influence, insisting it was still an accident and refusing to believe Jackson and his friends could be at fault. At school, whispers followed Sam and Ruby, and some friends grew distant, afraid of the Walters' retaliation. But Sam didn't care anymore. He was fully committed, ready to bear the weight of their scrutiny, determined to do whatever it took to clear Adeline's name. The article caught the attention of Detective Maria Collins from a nearby city. Known for her integrity and tenacity, Detective Collins reached out to Adeline's family, offering to look into the case unofficially. Her reputation was solid, and her approach was calm but relentless. After meeting with Adeline's mother, she reviewed every detail and became increasingly convinced that this was more than just an accident. Detective Collins promised the family she would investigate quietly, setting a course to gather evidence and prepare for a case that might finally reopen the investigation. Ruby's anxiety grew with every step forward. She'd never intended to be so deeply involved in something so dangerous. Late at night, she'd hear Jackson's mocking voice in her mind, replaying the night of the party. But her fear of staying silent was greater than her fear of speaking out. Sam noticed her anxiety and reassured her, insisting she wouldn't face this alone. He made sure she knew she had friends who would protect her, and in that quiet moment, Ruby found a small, new sense of courage. Detective Collins urged Sam and Ruby to recount every detail they could remember. Together, they revisited the night in their minds, piecing together timelines, recalling the sequence of events. Detective Collins advised them to make their own notes, document the fear Adeline had felt around Jackson, and the suspicious behavior from Jackson and his friends at the party. She wanted a solid timeline and testimony that would withstand scrutiny. Sam kept a meticulous record, determined not to let anything slip through the cracks. Detective Collins cleverly put pressure on Jackson's friends, subtly letting them know that the truth would eventually come out. At first, they stood firm, but soon, cracks in their stories started to show. Ben, one of the quieter boys in the group, finally broke under the pressure. He confessed privately to Detective Collins that Jackson's prank had gotten out of hand and that he'd regretted not stepping in. The detective now had a key witness, and it was only a matter of time before more would follow. With tensions escalating, a town council meeting was held to address the community's unrest. Adeline's mother, supported by Sam and others, made a powerful statement, demanding accountability and justice. Jackson's father, trying to control the narrative, downplayed his son's involvement, but the community could feel the weight of Adeline's mother's words. The once untouchable Walters family was starting to lose its grip, and the town was beginning to see through the facade. Sam watched as community members who had previously supported the Walters family started to question their loyalty. Detective Collins reached out to Sarah Linton, an ally in the district attorney's office, who reviewed the case with a fresh perspective. Shocked by the overlooked details and the boy's history of reckless behavior, Sarah agreed to lend her support. She promised to examine the case thoroughly and determine if new charges could be brought against Jackson and his friends. Her involvement marked a pivotal moment, as it meant a true legal force was now fighting for Adeline. During a heated confrontation with Sam at school, Jackson lost his composure. Angrily, he muttered that Adeline should have known it was a joke. His words, dripping with arrogance, were overheard by several classmates. Rumors spread quickly, and within hours, everyone knew what he had said. Sam knew the slip was another piece of evidence that could help prove Adeline's death was no accident. With mounting evidence, Detective Collins requested that the case be reopened. She presented everything to the town's police chief, citing witness testimonies, inconsistencies, and Jackson's past behaviors that pointed to a pattern of recklessness. The Walters family fought back hard, threatening lawsuits and using their influence, but Collins persisted. She wouldn't let them derail her efforts for justice. Detective Collins managed to secure a meeting with Ben, the boy who'd started to break under pressure. She recorded his confession, capturing his account of how the prank spiraled out of control, how Jackson had locked Adeline in the room to scare her, and how they'd ignored her banging on the door. He described how they laughed, never realizing the tragedy unfolding on the other side. Ben's confession was heart-wrenching and damning, and Collins knew this was the breakthrough they needed. With news of Ben's confession, the town was in an uproar. Community members called for Jackson's arrest, and peaceful protests were organized in Adeline's honor. Her friends painted murals and created a memorial, refusing to let her memory fade. The pressure on local officials was now immense. They could no longer ignore the outcry, and discussions began about charging Jackson and his friends. With the evidence Detective Collins and Sam had gathered, Sarah Linton successfully convened a grand jury hearing to examine the case for potential charges. The hearing was tense, with the Walters family's lawyers attempting to discredit the witnesses and question Detective Collins's motives. But the testimonies, especially Ben's recorded confession, were powerful. The jury listened intently, aware that this was more than just another case. It was a fight for justice. After days of deliberation, the grand jury decided there was enough evidence to indict Jackson and two of his friends on charges of manslaughter and reckless endangerment. News of the indictment spread like wildfire, filling Sam, Ruby, and the community with relief. Adeline's family cried with both sorrow and hope, knowing that, finally, the wheels of justice were turning. The Walters family immediately went on the defensive, hiring the best attorneys to represent Jackson and framing him as a misunderstood boy caught in a tragic mistake. They released statements about his good character and charitable works, painting him as a victim of a media-fueled. Their influence still held sway in some circles, but Sam and Adeline's friends continued to fight back, refusing to let the truth be drowned out. Sam, Ruby, and Detective Collins worked tirelessly with Sarah Linton to prepare for the trial. They rehearsed their testimonies, focusing on Adeline's story and the harm Jackson's so-called prank had caused. Sam found strength in the memory of Adeline, determined to do right by her even if it meant reliving the painful memories. They all knew this trial was the final hurdle, the last chance to get the justice she deserved. The trial drew a massive crowd, with reporters, community members, and Adeline's family and friends filling the courtroom. As the prosecution presented their case, recounting Adeline's final moments and the boys' disregard for her safety, emotions ran high. Sam testified, describing Adeline's fears, her life, and what her loss meant to him. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but he held his head high, remembering that he was doing this for her. The defense attorneys argued that Jackson had no malicious intent, framing his actions as a tragic mistake that had been blown out of proportion. They claimed he never meant to hurt Adeline, describing him as a young man whose prank had gone terribly wrong. Jackson's family appeared somber, painting him as a remorseful boy caught in a misunderstanding. But Sam could see through the charade, knowing that the truth was much darker than they would ever admit. When Ruby took the stand, her hands shook, but her voice was steady. She recounted the events, emphasizing the laughter and cruelty she'd witnessed from Jackson and his friends. Her testimony was raw and powerful, painting a picture of a girl who'd been ignored and belittled by boys who saw her as nothing more than a target. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words cutting through the pretense. In their closing statements, the prosecution urged the jury to remember that Adeline's life was worth more than a harmless prank. They asked the jury to see the truth. Jackson and his friends' actions had cost an innocent girl her life. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for mercy, arguing that Jackson had already been punished by the weight of his own guilt. The jury was left to deliberate, torn between the two narratives. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Jackson and his friends were convicted of manslaughter, and the courtroom erupted in both relief and sorrow. Sam felt a mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Adeline back. Her family hugged him tightly, grateful that he had fought for her, grateful that her story had finally been heard. The Walters family left in silence, their power unable to protect them from the truth. In the weeks that followed, Sam and Ruby tried to move on, finding ways to honor Adeline's memory. They created a scholarship in her name, helping young girls pursue their dreams, ensuring her legacy would live on. Sam knew he'd never fully heal from the loss, but he also knew that justice, in some small way, had been served.